Alexander Campbell spent the first 20 years of his life in Northern Ireland. In 1808, he and his family sailed for America to join Thomas Campbell, but they were shipwrecked and forced to spend a year in Scotland. Then, in 1809, they set sail for America a second time. It was a stormy crossing, and the ship leaked, but after 57 days, they arrived in New York. They headed west across Pennsylvania by wagon and were met by Thomas Campbell. After a joyous reunion with his family, Thomas took them to their new home in Washington, Pennsylvania. But Thomas had some shocking news for his family. He was no longer a Presbyterian minister.
When Thomas Campbell finally rejected the exclusivism and the creed of the Seceder Presbyterians, they were furious, and they moved to exclude him from their fellowship and filed heresy charges against him. Well, Thomas at that point had no choice but to cut his ties with the Presbyterians. He kept on preaching, and he kept on teaching, but he was really a man without a church. So he and some of his friends in southwest Pennsylvania formed what they called the Christian Association of Washington. This wasn't a church, it was not a denomination, but it was simply a study group whereby they intended to study how they could bring Christian unity. When Alexander arrived on these shores and heard this news, he marveled, because he too had cut his ties with the Presbyterians in the Old World.
Alexander learned that his father had just written the Declaration and Address, and this document would have a great impact on the Restoration movement in America.
I think we've talked a lot in our history, particularly disciples, about the Declaration and Address. It's one of the great classics of the Christian unity movement, which is very true. But equally fascinating is the fact that it, at the same time, and quite consciously so, was an American religious declaration of independence.
The Declaration and Address has a twofold plea. First, the unity of all believers, and second, a restoration of the primitive church. And Thomas Campbell believed that the only way to achieve unity was by going back to the Bible and restoring New Testament Christianity. He wrote, "Division among Christians is a horrid evil, fraught with many evils. It is anti-Christian, anti-scriptural, and anti-natural. To achieve unity, we must return to the original standard of Christianity, the profession and practice of the primitive church as exhibited in the New Testament. The New Testament is a perfect constitution for the worship, discipline, and government of the church, and a perfect rule for the duties of its members."
Thomas Campbell, quite consciously in this document, was saying, let's throw off all the outworn creeds and councils, the teachings from them, what he called the stumbling block of the ages, what Bacon had called the cobwebs of learning, and Locke had called the rubbish of the ages. Let's throw off these ideas, and in our new country, let's make a new charter of religious freedom by appealing to the first principles and standards of the New Testament.
The Declaration and Address was a clear statement of what Alexander had been groping for, and he would give his life to working for this dream, Christian unity, by going back to the Bible.
Just as I've said, I think all of us in any of our movements, from the Campbell Stone movement, ought to reread the Declaration and Address at least once a year.
But Alexander Campbell, at age 22, had other interests.
And soon thereafter, though, Thomas Campbell, with very canny insight, sent Alexander to return some books to farmer John Brown, who lived over the border into the panhandle of Virginia, and who had an only daughter, Margaret. The story goes, and I think it's one that might be believed, that when Margaret saw him ride up, she remarked to a friend who was there, "That's the young gentleman I'm going to marry." So she had spirit, and they did marry. And I think it must have been a very good marriage, except the fact that, of course, Margaret, as we know, became ill. She was tubercular, and so hers becomes, of course, a quite tragic story in his life. And yet I feel that she probably was the really great love of his life.
Alexander began preaching a year before his marriage to Margaret, and he preached over 100 sermons in 1 year. But he and his father realized the Christian Association had to become a church. So the Brush Run Church was organized. The original building at Brush Run has not been preserved, but this painting gives an idea of what it looked like. Again and again, when people have wanted to restore the practices of the early church, the form of baptism has become an issue. With Alexander and Margaret, the birth of a daughter make it a practical question.
When ever a child is born in a family, this is a momentous event. But when Campbell's child was born, he related it to the Scriptures as he did almost everything else. And through a long study of the subject, came to the conclusion that there just was no scriptural support for the baptism of infants. This led him to the decision that since he was one time an infant, that his baptism was not valid either. And so this eventuated in his going to a Baptist preacher and meeting with him privately, discussing this thoroughly, and not accepting the baptism of the Baptist, but the baptism of the New Testament.
It was June 1812 when Alexander was baptized in beautiful Buffalo Creek near his home. His father and mother and his wife Margaret were also baptized. And within a few weeks, the Brush Run Church was a congregation of immersed believers. This had several consequences.
First, Alexander assumed the leadership of the movement, and both he and his father sensed that this was the case. And then second, the goal for unity and restoration began to diverge because of immersion. It was a doctrine that not all accepted. And third, it gave a door for unity with the Baptist churches. The Redstone Baptist Association invited the Brush Run Church to become a member of that association. But the Campbells were reluctant to become members of the Baptist Association because they knew they would have to accept the Baptist Creed. But in 1815, they did become members of the association with the Brush Run Church. And for 15 additional years, the Campbells worked for reform among the Baptist churches.
Campbell represented the Baptist in 1820 in a debate with John Walker, a Presbyterian minister. The subject was baptism. The debate was published, and Campbell saw the power of the press. This led him to establish a journal called The Christian Baptist in 1823. He bought a printing press and began a long publishing career. Campbell was still committed to unity, but his emphasis was on restoration in the Christian Baptist. He wrote a series of 30 articles over 4 years on a restoration of the ancient order of things. The spirit of the paper was iconoclastic and satirical.
He needed much to gain an audience. And anyway, the satirical style much became him. We forget that his mother was French, and he could write with the biting pen of a Voltaire, and did so. And I feel that that exuberant, flamboyant, provocative style of the Christian Baptist really became him. I think he loved doing it.
Here's an example of how Campbell criticized the clergy. The third epistle of Peter. In all your gettings, get money. And when you shall hear of a church that is vacant and hath no one to preach therein, then be that a call unto you, and be ye mindful of the call, and take ye charge of the flock thereof, and of the fleece thereof, even of the golden fleece. And when ye shall have fleeced your flock, and shall know of another call, and if the flock be greater, or rather if the fleece be greater, then greater be also unto you the call. Then shall ye leave your old flock, and of the new flock shall ye take the charge. And you shall wax richer and richer, and lucre shall be no longer filthy in your sight. Needless to say, the Baptist ministers bitterly resented these attacks.
The Baptists also resented Walter Scott's preaching about baptism. Scott was the first person in this movement to preach repentance and baptism for the remission of sins. Scott had been born in Edinburgh, Scotland, was educated at the University of Edinburgh, came to this country in 1818, and settled in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he met Campbell. And he and Campbell became the closest of friends. Their friendship lasted for close to 40 years.
Walter Scott was an evangelist. And this made him different totally from Thomas and Alexander Campbell. I usually explain to people I'm talking to that Thomas Campbell was a teacher, Alexander Campbell was a lecturer, and Scott was a preacher.
In 1827, Campbell persuaded the Mahoning Baptist Association in Ohio to hire Walter Scott as their evangelist on the Western Reserve. Scott began preaching immersion for the forgiveness of sins, and the response was simply overwhelming. In a single year, 1,000 people were immersed. Others began preaching the same message, and soon the Campbell movement began to grow very, very rapidly.
It had tremendous appeal, and the Campbells' concepts of individual responsibility and liberty, all of that spoke well to these men of the Western waters. So after the division, of course, as we know, the number of converts was terrific. And Campbellism, as one of its opponents said, has become a raging epidemic.
Walter Scott's preaching and Campbell's call for restoration simply made it impossible for them to remain in the Baptist fellowship. The separation came around 1830, and it was sometimes extremely bitter and painful.
During the 1820s, Alexander Campbell began to learn of other people in America that were trying to go back to the Bible, including the Christians in Kentucky, who were led by Barton W. Stone. Campbell met Stone for the first time in 1824 when he was visiting in Kentucky. Stone had preached for the old Keene Ridge Church, and after the great revival meeting there, he and other Presbyterian ministers had left their church, and they had begun to establish independent churches called Christian churches or Churches of Christ. And by the time the Campbells established their Brush Run Church, the Stone movement already had congregations in a dozen states, stretching from Arkansas to New York. But as the two movements began to meet one another, they realized they shared many of the same common beliefs, but with some differences.
Stone was a revivalist. All you have to do is read his paper, and it emphasis upon camp meetings. Campbell was not a revivalist. In fact, he didn't even like the word revival, and so he would not even use it. Hence, we have the word protracted meeting instead of a revival. So it was a totally different approach between the two men. Although theologically, I think there were differences too that had major differences. I think their views of the Trinity, their views of the atonement, and such things as these made them two different men.
How were they able to unite with such great differences? Well, the fact of the matter is they did not feel that they were infallible in their understanding, and they were willing to give each other the same cordial acceptance of conclusions, and willing to stand on their conclusions, willing to be judged before God and men upon their conclusions, but they were their conclusions. And that kind of love, that kind of understanding is so sorely needed in our day.
The Stone and Campbell movements were able to unite because Barton Stone wanted it, because he believed in unity.
The unity was achieved in a meeting at Lexington, Kentucky in January of 1832. Barton Stone and John T. Johnson of the Campbell movement called a meeting of preachers and elders of both movements. The meeting lasted for 4 days at the old Hill Street Church, and they talked frankly about the many beliefs they shared and frankly about their differences of opinion. At the climax of the meeting, Barton Stone and Raccoon John Smith exchanged the right hand of fellowship. The unity began there at Lexington, spread like leaven among the churches, and within just 2 or 3 years, the two movements had come together and were united. But Alexander Campbell was not there for the Lexington meeting.
He felt that it was premature. He did not get very excited about it. He gave it a very low profile in his Millennial Harbinger.
Even though Campbell was not there at Lexington, this was an important milestone in the Restoration movement in America, because what happened at Lexington was what Thomas and Alexander Campbell had been dreaming of: Christian unity by going back to the Bible and restoring the church. Thomas Campbell's dream in the Declaration and Address had now become a reality.
A few years after the Stone and Campbell churches united, Alexander Campbell built a new study near his home at Bethany.
This study is a rather famous place. It has become a symbol of Mr. Campbell's influence. Alexander Campbell got the idea of building a study like this from Thomas Jefferson when he was a guest at Monticello. Mr. Jefferson's office, as you will remember, is out away from the house. Mr. Campbell had the same idea and built his study out away from the house for the benefit of the family and for his own work. But he incorporated Mr. Jefferson's idea of an hexagonal room. Campbell added one creative idea. Instead of having windows in the sides of his study, he had windows only at the top. And he created the verse, which later became a song, Lux descendit caelo, light comes from above. It was his idea that all illumination comes from Almighty God, moral, spiritual, as well as physical. And so he wanted to indicate that his message is God's message and not the message of other human beings.
Light from above. This dream brought Alexander Campbell from Ireland to America, and by the 1830s, he was the acknowledged leader of a dynamic, growing American religious movement. In generations to come, millions of people around the world would join him in his search for the light.